In the scorching heat of a remote military outpost where dust storms could blind you in seconds and enemy fire came without warning, nobody paid much attention to the quiet young woman who kept to herself in the corner tent. They called her Tent Girl behind her back, thinking she was just another support staff member who couldn't handle the real action. The seasoned soldiers would shake their heads when they saw her small frame struggling with heavy equipment, whispering that she didn't belong in a war zone. But when the worst attack in the unit's history struck at 3:47 a.m. on a moonless Tuesday, everything changed. As explosions rocked the compound and wounded soldiers cried out in the darkness, it wasn't the decorated combat veterans who stepped up to save lives. It was the quiet girl from the corner tent who transformed into something extraordinary. What happened next would make a hardened colonel break protocol to personally commend her actions, turn skeptical soldiers into believers, and prove that heroes don't always come in the package you expect. This is the true story of how one underestimated medic became the difference between life and death for an entire military unit, and why her commanding officer still calls her the bravest soldier he ever served with. The girl they once dismissed would soon show them what real courage looks like when everything is on the line. Sarah Martinez had always been small for her age. At 22 years old and barely 5 feet tall, she looked even younger than her actual years. When she stepped off the transport truck at Forward Operating Base Phoenix in Afghanistan, the other soldiers barely glanced her way. Those who did notice her assumed she was lost or looking for the administrative officers. The base was a collection of prefabricated buildings, tents, and defensive barriers carved out of the harsh desert landscape. Dust covered everything, and the constant sound of generators mixed with distant gunfire created an atmosphere that immediately separated the veterans from the newcomers. Sarah fell into the latter category, but not in the way most people thought. She had completed her medical training with top marks, specializing in battlefield trauma care. Her instructors had been impressed by her steady hands and calm demeanor under pressure during simulations. But here, in the real environment of a forward operating base, none of that seemed to matter. What mattered was that she looked like she belonged in a college dormitory, not a military compound in one of the world's most dangerous regions. The unit she was assigned to, Alpha Company, was a tight-knit group of infantry soldiers who had been deployed together for 8 months. They had seen combat, lost friends, and developed the kind of brotherhood that comes from shared hardship. When their previous medic was rotated out due to injury, they expected his replacement to be someone who could match their experience and intensity. Instead, they got Sarah. Sergeant First Class Mike Rodriguez was the first to express what everyone was thinking. A 15-year veteran with scars on his arms and a no-nonsense attitude, he took one look at Sarah and shook his head. "This is what they sent us?" he muttered to his squad leader. "She looks like she should be serving coffee, not saving lives in a firefight." The sentiment spread quickly through the unit. During her first week, Sarah noticed how conversations would stop when she walked into the mess tent. Soldiers would give her polite nods but keep their distance. They weren't being deliberately cruel, but their skepticism was obvious. In their minds, she hadn't earned the right to be part of their brotherhood yet. Sarah tried to prove herself in small ways. She volunteered for extra duties, studied medical procedures late into the night by flashlight, and attempted to engage with the other soldiers during downtime, but her efforts seemed to have little effect. The informal hierarchy of the unit placed experienced combat soldiers at the top, and as the new medic with no combat experience, she found herself at the bottom. The living arrangements reflected this social dynamic. While the veteran soldiers bunked together in the main sleeping quarters, Sarah was assigned to a small tent on the perimeter of the compound. It wasn't punishment exactly, but it wasn't inclusion either. The tent was basic even by military standards, with a cot, a small storage locker, and barely enough room to stand upright. The isolation was both physical and emotional. Lieutenant Colonel James Thompson, the unit commander, was aware of the situation but chose not to intervene directly. Thompson was a career officer who had learned to let his soldiers work out their own dynamics, within reason. He had read Sarah's file and was impressed by her medical credentials, but he also understood the concerns of his experienced troops. Trust in a unit like this had to be earned, not assigned. What Thompson didn't realize was how closely Sarah was watching and learning from everyone around her. During her first month at the base, she observed the unit's routines, memorized the location of every piece of medical equipment, and studied the tactical procedures used during patrols. She wasn't just trying to fit in, she was preparing herself for situations she hoped would never come. The base operated on a constant cycle of patrols, guard duties, and maintenance work. Sarah accompanied several patrols as the unit medic, but these missions were mostly routine sweeps through relatively quiet sectors. The most serious medical situation she encountered was treating a soldier's twisted ankle after he stepped in a hole during a night patrol. It was important work, but it didn't require the kind of skills that would impress hardened infantry troops. Meanwhile, the soldiers continued to refer to her as Tent Girl when they thought she couldn't hear. The nickname wasn't meant to be malicious, but it reflected how they saw her, as someone apart from the real unit, someone who happened to live in the tent on the edge of their community. Sarah heard the name and understood what it meant, but she didn't complain or ask them to stop. She knew that respect had to be earned, not demanded. Her daily routine became a study in quiet determination. She would wake before dawn to check and restock her medical supplies. During the day, she would shadow other medics when possible, learning from their experience and asking questions about combat medicine. In the evenings, she would study medical texts and practice procedures on training dummies that she set up in her tent. The other soldiers noticed her dedication, but many saw it as the actions of someone trying too hard to compensate for obvious deficiencies. Corporal Danny Wright, a machine gunner with 2 deployments under his belt, summed up the general attitude. She's trying, I'll give her that. But trying and doing are 2 different things when bullets start flying. Sarah's first real test came during her 2nd month at the base. A patrol returned with a soldier suffering from severe heat exhaustion. The man was unconscious, his body temperature dangerously high, and his breathing shallow. Sarah immediately took charge of the situation, ordering ice packs, establishing an IV line, and coordinating his transport to the base's small medical facility. Her movements were quick and precise, her voice calm and authoritative. Within minutes, she had stabilized the soldier's condition and probably saved his life. The soldiers who witnessed her actions were impressed, but they attributed it to good training rather than real competence under pressure. Heat exhaustion wasn't the same as treating combat wounds while under fire. The incident did earn Sarah a small measure of recognition from Lieutenant Colonel Thompson. He made a point of thanking her personally for her quick thinking and professional response, but even this acknowledgement felt somewhat hollow to Sarah, as she could sense that she was still being evaluated and judged rather than fully accepted. As her 3rd month at the base began, Sarah had settled into her role as the unit's medic, but she remained an outsider in their social structure. She ate her meals quickly and quietly, spent her free time alone in her tent, and focused on her professional duties with single-minded determination. The soldiers respected her medical knowledge but didn't yet trust her with their lives in the way that true unit cohesion required. The irony of the situation wasn't lost on Sarah. She had joined the military specifically to serve in combat medicine, to use her skills where they were most needed. But now that she was in that environment, she found herself isolated from the very people she had trained to help. The tent that had become her home felt more like a symbol of her separation from the unit than a place of belonging. What none of them knew was that Sarah's apparent isolation had actually given her a unique perspective on the base's operations. From her tent on the perimeter, she had a clear view of the defensive positions and approach routes. Her late-night study sessions had made her more familiar with emergency procedures than anyone else on the base, and her quiet observation of the unit's dynamics had taught her exactly who she could rely on and how they would react under stress. All of this knowledge was about to become crucial in ways that none of them could imagine. The quiet girl in the corner tent was far more prepared for what was coming than anyone realized, including herself. The first signs of trouble came 3 days before the attack. Intelligence reports indicated increased enemy movement in the region surrounding forward operating Base Phoenix. Radio chatter suggested that insurgent forces were planning something significant, though the exact nature and timing remained unclear. Lieutenant Colonel Thompson increased security patrols and put the base on heightened alert status. Sarah noticed the change in atmosphere immediately. The casual conversations between soldiers became more focused and serious. Equipment checks that were normally routine became thorough inspections. The veteran soldiers moved with the kind of purposeful tension that came from experience with dangerous situations. For Sarah, it was both educational and intimidating to watch professionals prepare for combat. During this period, Sarah made a decision that would prove crucial later. She began conducting her own preparations beyond what was officially required. Each night, she would review the layout of the base's medical facilities, checking the locations of supplies and equipment. She memorized the fastest routes between different areas of the compound and identified alternative paths in case the primary routes became blocked or dangerous. Her tent's location on the perimeter, which had initially seemed like isolation, now provided her with a strategic advantage. From her position, she could monitor the base's defensive perimeter and observe potential approach routes that enemies might use. She began keeping a detailed mental map of defensive positions, noting which areas might be vulnerable and where wounded soldiers would most likely be brought during an attack. The medical supplies at Forward Operating Base Phoenix were adequate for routine injuries but limited for mass casualty situations. Sarah took inventory of everything available and began organizing supplies for maximum efficiency. She created portable medical kits that could be quickly deployed to different areas of the base, each containing the most essential items for trauma care. Her fellow soldiers noticed her increased activity, but assumed it was just another example of her overprepared nature. Sergeant Rodriguez, who had been among the most skeptical of Sarah's capabilities, watched her preparations with grudging interest. During a particularly thorough equipment inspection, he noticed that Sarah had memorized not just the medical supplies, but also the tactical equipment and weapon positions throughout the base. When he questioned her about it, she simply explained that understanding the entire operational environment made her more effective as a medic. "You know where every machine gun position is located," Rodriguez observed. "That's not typical medic knowledge." Sarah's response was matter-of-fact. "If I need to reach wounded soldiers under fire, I need to know where the covering fire will come from and which routes will be safest. Medical training includes tactical awareness." Rodriguez found himself impressed despite his initial skepticism. Her approach to medical preparedness was more comprehensive than he had expected, showing a level of strategic thinking that went beyond basic medical protocols. For the first time, he began to consider that perhaps the quiet girl in the tent might be more competent than her appearance suggested. The increased alert status also meant more frequent patrols and longer shifts for all personnel. Sarah accompanied several of these patrols, gaining valuable experience in how the unit operated under stress. She observed how different soldiers reacted to pressure, who remained calm under difficult circumstances, and how the chain of command functioned during potentially dangerous situations. During one particularly tense patrol, the unit encountered an improvised explosive device that had been recently planted but not yet activated. While the explosive ordnance disposal team worked to neutralize the device, Sarah positioned herself strategically to provide immediate medical support if something went wrong. Her positioning showed that she understood both the tactical situation and her role within it, earning quiet approval from some of the more experienced soldiers. Lieutenant Colonel Thompson had been monitoring Sarah's performance and noted her professional development with satisfaction. In his experience, the best combat medics were those who understood the broader tactical environment, not just medical procedures. Sarah was demonstrating exactly that kind of comprehensive awareness. He made a mental note to include positive comments about her development in his next report to higher command. As the base's alert status continued, Sarah established routines that would prove essential during the coming crisis. Each morning, she would conduct what she privately called her readiness check. This involved verifying the status of all medical supplies, confirming the location of key personnel, and reviewing the base's current defensive posture. It was more thorough than what was officially required, but Sarah had learned to trust her own standards rather than minimum requirements. Her evening routine was equally systematic. Before sleeping, she would review the day's activities, update her mental map of the base's current status, and prepare her personal equipment for immediate deployment. Her medical kit was always packed and ready, positioned where she could reach it quickly, even in darkness. Her uniform and boots were laid out for rapid dressing, and she kept a flashlight and backup medical supplies within arm's reach. These preparations might have seemed excessive to observers, but Sarah had internalized a lesson from her medical training. The difference between life and death often came down to seconds, and those seconds were determined by preparation that happened hours or days earlier. She couldn't control when an emergency would occur, but she could control how ready she would be when it happened. The social dynamics of the unit also began to shift slightly during this period. While Sarah was still not fully integrated into the informal brotherhood of the infantry soldiers, her visible competence and dedication earned her a measure of professional respect. Soldiers began asking her questions about medical procedures and seeking her advice about minor injuries and health concerns. Corporal Wright, who had previously been dismissive of Sarah's capabilities, found himself reconsidering his assessment. During a conversation with other soldiers, he admitted that her medical knowledge was impressive and that she seemed to take her responsibilities seriously. "Maybe she's not what I expected," he said, "but she knows her stuff when it comes to medical care." This gradual shift in perception was important for unit cohesion, but it hadn't yet reached the level of trust that would be crucial during combat. The soldiers respected Sarah's medical expertise, but they hadn't yet seen her perform under the extreme stress of actual combat. In their experience, training and real-world performance could be very different things, especially for someone who looked as young and inexperienced as Sarah. The intelligence reports continued to suggest increasing enemy activity, but the exact threat remained unclear. Some intelligence indicated a possible attack on the base, while other reports suggested that enemy forces might be planning to target patrols or supply convoys. The uncertainty created a tension that affected everyone on the base, from the commanding officer to the newest soldiers. Sarah found herself both nervous and excited about the possibility of facing a real emergency. Her training had prepared her for combat medicine, but training simulations could never fully replicate the chaos and pressure of actual combat. She knew that if an attack came, it would be her first real test as a combat medic, and the lives of her fellow soldiers might depend on her performance. During quiet moments, she would sometimes imagine different emergency scenarios and mentally rehearse her responses. Where would she position herself during an attack? How would she prioritize multiple casualties? What equipment would she need for different types of injuries? These mental exercises helped her feel more prepared, but they also reminded her that theoretical knowledge and practical application were not the same thing. As the third day of heightened alert passed without incident, some soldiers began to relax slightly. The human tendency was to assume that if nothing had happened yet, perhaps nothing would happen at all. But Sarah maintained her readiness protocols, understanding that emergencies rarely announce themselves in advance. Her persistence in maintaining high levels of preparation, even when others began to relax, would soon prove to be one of the most important decisions of her life. The stage was set for a confrontation that would test everyone on the base, but especially the quiet young woman who had spent months preparing for a moment she hoped would never come. In her small tent on the perimeter, Sarah continued her nightly preparations, unaware that in just a few hours, everything she had learned and practiced would be put to the ultimate test. The attack began at 3:47 a.m. on a Tuesday morning when most of the base was asleep. Sarah was awakened not by the first explosion, but by the subtle change in the generator's hum that preceded it by several seconds. Her months of light sleeping and constant alertness had trained her to notice such details. She was already reaching for her boots when the first mortar round struck the communications building. The explosion shattered the pre-dawn quiet with devastating force. Within seconds, the entire base was transformed from a sleeping military compound into a chaotic battlefield. Emergency sirens wailed as more explosions erupted across the facility. The coordinated attack was hitting multiple targets simultaneously, creating exactly the kind of mass casualty situation that Sarah had been mentally preparing for. Sarah's response was automatic and immediate. While other personnel were still processing what was happening, she was already dressed and moving toward her medical supplies. The training that had seemed excessive to some observers now proved its value. Her equipment was exactly where it needed to be. Her uniform was ready, and her mind was clear despite the chaos erupting around her. The enemy had planned their attack carefully. The initial barrage targeted key infrastructure, the communications center, the motor pool, and the main administrative building. But they had also positioned teams to attack the base's defensive perimeters, creating multiple fronts that stretched the garrison's ability to respond effectively. It was the kind of coordinated assault that could overwhelm even experienced military units. From her tent on the perimeter, Sarah had a clear view of the attack's development. She could see muzzle flashes from enemy positions in the hills surrounding the base, and she could hear the distinctive sounds of different weapons being fired. Her tactical awareness, developed through months of careful observation, allowed her to understand the attack pattern even in the first few minutes of chaos. The first casualties began arriving at the medical facility within minutes of the attack's start. But the medical facility itself had been damaged by a mortar round, and much of the equipment was either destroyed or inaccessible. The senior medic on duty was injured in the initial explosion, leaving Sarah as the most experienced medical personnel immediately available to respond. Lieutenant Colonel Thompson was coordinating the defensive response from the command bunker when he received word that the medical facility was compromised. His immediate concern was for the wounded soldiers who would need treatment. When he asked about available medical personnel, he was told that the new medic, Sarah Martinez, was setting up a field treatment area near the motor pool. Sarah had made a tactical decision that demonstrated both her medical knowledge and her understanding of the base's layout. Instead of trying to work in the damaged medical facility, she had quickly assessed the situation and moved to establish an alternative treatment area in a location that was more protected from ongoing fire, but still accessible to wounded soldiers. It was exactly the kind of adaptive thinking that distinguished good medics from great ones. Her first patient was Sergeant Rodriguez, the same soldier who had initially questioned her capabilities. He had been wounded by shrapnel from an explosion near the defensive perimeter and was bleeding heavily from wounds to his leg and arm. As he was carried to Sarah's improvised treatment area, he was conscious but in significant pain and losing blood rapidly. Sarah's response to Rodriguez's injuries became the defining moment of her military career. Working by the light of emergency flares and with explosions continuing around the base, she quickly assessed his wounds and began treatment. Her hands were steady, her voice was calm, and her actions were precise and efficient. She controlled the bleeding, started an IV line, and administered pain medication while continuously monitoring his vital signs. What impressed Rodriguez even more than her medical skills was her demeanor under fire. While explosions continued to rock the base and gunfire echoed from multiple directions, Sarah worked with the same focused concentration she had shown during routine medical procedures. She didn't flinch when a mortar round exploded nearby, and she didn't rush her procedures despite the obvious danger. "Stay with me, Sergeant," she said as she worked on his wounds. "You're going to be fine, but I need you to stay conscious and help me monitor your condition." Rodriguez found himself following her instructions automatically. Despite his initial skepticism about her capabilities, he felt completely confident in her care. Her competence under extreme pressure was obvious, and her calm presence actually helped him remain calm as well. For the first time since the attack began, he felt that his situation was under control. As Sarah worked on Rodriguez, other wounded soldiers began arriving at her treatment area. The base's defensive positions were taking heavy casualties, and the normal medical evacuation procedures had been disrupted by the ongoing attack. Sarah found herself treating multiple patients simultaneously while coordinating with other personnel to establish a more organized medical response. Her preparation proved crucial in these moments. Because she had memorized the location of medical supplies throughout the base, she could direct other soldiers to retrieve specific items even when the primary medical facility was inaccessible. Her understanding of the base's layout allowed her to position her treatment area where it would be most effective, and her tactical awareness helped her anticipate where additional casualties would likely come from. Private Johnson, a communications specialist, arrived with severe burns from an explosion in the communications center. Corporal Williams came in with a gunshot wound to the shoulder. Specialist Chen had multiple shrapnel wounds from a mortar impact. Each case required different treatment priorities, and Sarah had to manage all of them while continuing to monitor Rodriguez's condition. What made Sarah's performance remarkable was not just her medical skills, but her ability to organize and coordinate the entire medical response. She quickly established a triage system, prioritizing patients based on the severity of their injuries and the likelihood of successful treatment. She directed other soldiers to assist with basic medical procedures, turning non-medical personnel into effective medical assistants through clear instructions and confident leadership. Lieutenant Colonel Thompson received regular updates about the medical situation as he coordinated the base's defense. The reports about Sarah's performance were consistently positive, with multiple soldiers commenting on her professionalism and effectiveness. Thompson found himself impressed not just by her medical capabilities, but by her leadership under pressure. The attack continued for over 2 hours, with enemy forces maintaining pressure on multiple fronts. During this period, Sarah treated 15 wounded soldiers, saved at least 3 lives through immediate intervention, and coordinated medical care for the entire base. She worked continuously without breaks, moving between patients and adjusting her treatment priorities as new casualties arrived. Her most challenging case came near the end of the attack when Corporal Martinez, no relation, despite the shared surname, arrived with severe internal injuries from an explosion. His condition was critical, requiring immediate surgery that would normally be performed in a hospital setting. But with no way to evacuate him, and his life slipping away, Sarah had to attempt procedures that stretched her training to its limits. Working with basic equipment in less than ideal conditions, Sarah performed what amounted to field surgery on Corporal Martinez. She had to make life or death decisions with incomplete information and limited resources. The pressure was enormous, with other soldiers watching and knowing that their comrade's survival depended entirely on her skills and judgment. The procedure was successful. Corporal Martinez survived his injuries and would eventually make a full recovery. But more importantly for unit morale, every soldier who witnessed Sarah's work that night understood that they had completely misjudged her capabilities. The quiet girl from the tent had proven herself to be exactly the kind of medic they needed in combat. As dawn broke and the enemy attack finally subsided, Sarah continued working to stabilize and treat the wounded. She had been awake and working intensively for over 6 hours, but she showed no signs of fatigue. Her focus remained sharp, and her medical procedures continued to be precise and effective. The transformation in how other soldiers viewed Sarah was immediate and dramatic. Men who had previously called her Tent Girl were now referring to her as Doc, with obvious respect and gratitude. Sergeant Rodriguez, whose life she had saved, became one of her strongest advocates, telling anyone who would listen about her incredible performance under fire. But perhaps the most significant recognition came from Lieutenant Colonel Thompson himself, who made a point of personally visiting each wounded soldier as soon as the tactical situation permitted. When multiple soldiers independently told him about Sarah's exceptional performance, he knew he was hearing about something extraordinary. In the immediate aftermath of the attack, forward operating Base Phoenix looked like a war zone. Smoke still rose from damaged buildings, debris littered the compound, and the acrid smell of explosives hung in the air. But despite the destruction, there was a sense of relief among the soldiers. They had survived a coordinated enemy assault. And remarkably, not a single soldier had died during the attack. Lieutenant Colonel Thompson conducted his initial damage assessment while medics from other units began arriving to assist with casualties. As he walked through the base, surveying the destruction and speaking with his soldiers, he kept hearing the same story repeated. Sarah Martinez had saved lives that night. Not just one or two, but potentially every wounded soldier who had come under her care. The statistics were compelling. 15 soldiers had been wounded during the attack, ranging from minor injuries to life-threatening trauma. Under normal circumstances, in an attack of this intensity, the base could have expected to lose 2 or 3 soldiers to their injuries. Instead, every wounded soldier was alive and stable, and most were expected to make full recoveries. Sergeant Rodriguez was among the first to approach Thompson directly about Sarah's performance. Despite his own injuries, Rodriguez was adamant about ensuring that Sarah received proper recognition for her actions during the attack. "Colonel, you need to know what that medic did last night," Rodriguez said, his voice still weak from blood loss but his conviction strong. "I've been in combat for 15 years, and I've never seen anything like it. She saved my life, probably saved all our lives. She deserves a medal for what she did out there." Similar conversations occurred throughout the day as Thompson spoke with other wounded soldiers and the personnel who had witnessed Sarah's work. Corporal Williams described how Sarah had performed emergency surgery in the middle of a firefight. Private Johnson talked about how her calm presence had helped him remain conscious during treatment for severe burns. Each account added to a picture of exceptional performance under the most challenging circumstances imaginable. But Thompson was most impressed by the accounts from soldiers who weren't medical personnel but had assisted Sarah during the attack. These soldiers described how she had turned them into effective medical assistants through clear instruction and confident leadership. She had organized the entire medical response for the base while simultaneously providing hands-on care for the most seriously wounded soldiers. Corporal Danny Wright, who had initially questioned whether Sarah belonged in a combat zone, sought out Thompson specifically to discuss what he had witnessed. Wright had been assigned to help carry wounded soldiers to the treatment area and had observed Sarah's work throughout the night. "Colonel, I was wrong about her," Wright said. "I thought she was too small, too young, too inexperienced. But last night, she was the strongest person on this base. She never hesitated, never panicked, never stopped working. I've served with a lot of medics, and I've never seen anyone perform like that under fire." These testimonials from experienced combat soldiers carried significant weight with Thompson. He knew that earning the respect of veteran infantry troops was not easy, especially for someone who had initially been viewed with skepticism. The fact that Sarah had not only earned their respect but their admiration spoke volumes about her performance during the crisis. Thompson also reviewed the tactical aspects of Sarah's response. Her decision to relocate the medical treatment area when the primary facility was damaged showed excellent judgment under pressure. Her understanding of the base's layout and defensive positions had allowed her to choose an optimal location that provided both protection and accessibility. These were not just medical decisions, they were tactical decisions that required understanding the broader combat situation. The medical supplies management during the attack had been equally impressive. Because Sarah had spent months cataloging and organizing medical equipment throughout the base, she was able to direct other soldiers to retrieve specific supplies even when normal supply chains were disrupted. This preparation had been crucial in treating the variety of injuries that occurred during the attack. Dr. Patricia Hayes, a senior military physician who arrived with the medical reinforcement team, conducted a thorough review of all medical procedures performed during the attack. Her assessment of Sarah's work was unqualified praise. According to Dr. Hayes, the medical care provided during the attack met or exceeded the standards that would be expected in a field hospital, despite being performed in a combat zone with limited equipment. The triage decisions were textbook perfect, Dr. Hayes reported to Thompson. The treatment priorities were exactly right for a mass casualty situation, and some of the procedures she performed were honestly beyond what I would expect from a medic with her level of experience. She must have extraordinary natural talent combined with exceptional training. What Dr. Hayes found most impressive was the documentation that Sarah had maintained throughout the attack. Despite the chaos and time pressure, she had somehow managed to record essential medical information for each patient, including treatment provided, medications administered, and changes in condition over time. This documentation was crucial for continued care and demonstrated a level of professionalism that exceeded standard expectations. The wounded soldiers themselves were perhaps Sarah's strongest advocates. As they recovered from their injuries, they repeatedly asked about the medic who had treated them during the attack. Many of them had been semi-conscious or in shock during treatment and hadn't fully appreciated what was happening at the time. But as they learned more about the circumstances of their care, their gratitude and respect for Sarah grew. Corporal Martinez, who had received emergency surgery from Sarah during the attack, was particularly vocal about his experience. His injuries had been severe enough that he would normally have been evacuated to a major medical facility immediately. Instead, Sarah's field surgery had stabilized his condition enough that he could wait for proper evacuation without risk to his life. "She saved me when there was no other option," Martinez told his visitors. "I was dying, and she brought me back. I don't care what anyone thought about her before that night. In my book, she's a hero." The story of Sarah's performance began to spread beyond Forward Operating Base Phoenix. When wounded soldiers were evacuated to larger medical facilities, they carried accounts of the extraordinary medic who had saved lives during the attack. Medical personnel at these facilities were impressed by the quality of care that had been provided under such difficult circumstances. Lieutenant Colonel Thompson found himself facing an unusual but pleasant situation, deciding how to properly recognize exceptional performance by one of his soldiers. Military decorations existed for exactly this type of heroism, but Thompson wanted to ensure that Sarah's actions received appropriate recognition, both within the military system and among her fellow soldiers. The Bronze Star Medal was typically awarded for heroic or meritorious achievement in connection with military operations. Sarah's actions during the attack clearly met the criteria for this decoration, but Thompson felt that even this level of recognition might not fully capture the significance of what she had accomplished. More importantly, Thompson wanted to ensure that Sarah's story became part of the unit's history and identity. What she had done represented the best traditions of military service, competence, courage, and selfless dedication to fellow soldiers. Her example could inspire other soldiers and help establish the kind of unit culture that Thompson wanted to maintain. The respect that Sarah had earned from her fellow soldiers was perhaps more meaningful than any formal decoration. Soldiers who had previously kept their distance now sought out her company. The informal social hierarchy that had excluded her was completely reorganized around recognition of her exceptional abilities and character. Sergeant Rodriguez, whose life Sarah had saved, appointed himself as her unofficial protector and advocate. He made it clear to anyone who would listen that Sarah Martinez was not just a competent medic, but one of the bravest soldiers he had ever served with. His endorsement carried significant weight with other enlisted soldiers. The nickname Tent Girl disappeared entirely, replaced by respectful terms like Doc or simply Sarah. But more significantly, the social isolation that had characterized her first months at the base was completely eliminated. She was now fully integrated into the unit's brotherhood, accepted not just as a competent professional, but as a trusted comrade. For Sarah herself, the recognition was gratifying, but secondary to the knowledge that she had successfully performed her duties when it mattered most. Her months of preparation had paid off, and she had proven to herself as much as to others that she belonged in combat medicine. The quiet confidence that had sustained her through months of skepticism was now validated by undeniable results. The attack on Forward Operating Base Phoenix had tested everyone, but it had revealed Sarah Martinez to be exactly the kind of soldier that the military needed. Her story was becoming a powerful example of how preparation, competence, and courage could triumph over initial skepticism and apparent disadvantages. 2 weeks after the attack, Lieutenant Colonel Thompson made a decision that would become one of the most memorable moments of his military career. He called a special formation for all available personnel at Forward Operating Base Phoenix, ostensibly for a routine briefing. But as the soldiers assembled in the main courtyard, it became clear that something unusual was happening. Thompson had spent considerable time preparing his remarks for this occasion. In his 25 years of military service, he had witnessed many acts of courage and heroism, but he had never seen a single individual's actions have such a profound impact on an entire unit. Sarah's performance during the attack had not only saved lives, but had also transformed the culture and morale of Alpha Company. As the formation came to attention, Thompson began speaking about the attack and its aftermath. He reviewed the tactical situation, praised the unit's overall response, and acknowledged the successful defense of the base. But then his tone became more personal as he began discussing individual acts of heroism during the crisis. 2 weeks ago, this base came under the most severe attack in its operational history, Thompson began. 15 of our soldiers were wounded in that attack, some critically. Under normal circumstances, we could have expected to lose soldiers to their injuries. Instead, every wounded soldier survived, and most have already returned to duty, or will do so shortly. The assembled soldiers knew where this was heading, and many glanced towards Sarah, who was standing in formation with the other medics. She maintained her military bearing, but Thompson could see that she was somewhat uncomfortable with being the focus of attention. The reason we suffered no fatalities during this attack was the exceptional performance of hospital corpsman Sarah Martinez, Thompson continued. Her actions during the attack represent the finest traditions of military medicine and exemplify the courage and competence that we expect from all soldiers. Thompson then did something that surprised even his senior staff. He read detailed accounts of Sarah's actions during the attack, describing specific medical procedures she had performed and lives she had saved. He talked about her preparation, her tactical awareness, and her leadership under fire. The accounts were compelling not just because of what Sarah had accomplished, but because they demonstrated how thoroughly Thompson had investigated and documented her performance. Hospital corpsman Martinez didn't just treat wounded soldiers, Thompson explained. She organized and coordinated the entire medical response for this base while under fire. She performed emergency surgery with basic equipment in a combat zone. She turned non-medical personnel into effective medical assistants through clear instruction and confident leadership. The colonel's voice carried obvious admiration as he continued. I have recommended Hospital corpsman Martinez for the Bronze Star Medal for heroic achievement in connection with military operations. But more importantly, I want every soldier here to understand that what she accomplished represents the standard of performance and dedication that makes units like this successful. The formation remained silent as Thompson concluded his remarks, but the impact of his words was obvious. Many of the soldiers had witnessed parts of Sarah's performance during the attack, but hearing the complete account from their commanding officer gave them a fuller appreciation of what had occurred. When Thompson called Sarah forward to receive his personal commendation, the spontaneous applause from her fellow soldiers was immediate and sustained. These were combat veterans who didn't give their respect easily, but their response to Sarah was unqualified admiration. She had earned their recognition through performance under the most challenging circumstances possible. Sergeant Rodriguez, whose life Sarah had saved, later described the moment as one of the most meaningful events he had witnessed in his military career. To see her get the recognition she deserved, especially from the colonel in front of the whole unit, that was justice, he said. She had proven herself in the most important way possible, and everyone knew it. The formal recognition from Lieutenant Colonel Thompson had significance beyond the immediate moment. Military careers are built on performance evaluations and recommendations from commanding officers, and Thompson's enthusiastic endorsement of Sarah's capabilities would follow her throughout her career. His recommendation carried considerable weight because of his own reputation and experience, but the real transformation had already occurred in how Sarah was viewed and treated by her fellow soldiers. The young woman who had once eaten meals alone now found herself surrounded by soldiers eager to share stories and seek her advice. The medic who had been isolated in her perimeter tent was now invited to join informal gatherings and discussions. The physical symbol of this change came when Sergeant Rodriguez and several other soldiers approached Sarah about relocating from her tent to the main sleeping quarters. They had cleared space and wanted her to join them in the shared accommodations that represented full membership in the unit's brotherhood. Sarah's response to this invitation revealed the depth of her character. While she appreciated the gesture and understood its significance, she chose to remain in her tent. Not out of continued isolation, but because she had come to see the tent as her command post for medical operations. Its location on the perimeter gave her strategic advantages that she didn't want to give up. I appreciate the offer more than you know, she told Rodriguez. But I've realized that my tent location actually helps me do my job better. I can monitor the entire base from there, and I can respond quickly to emergencies anywhere on the perimeter. This response impressed the soldiers even more than acceptance would have. Sarah was thinking strategically about how to best serve the unit rather than simply seeking social acceptance. Her decision showed that she had found her place in the unit's structure and was confident enough in that place to make decisions based on professional rather than personal considerations. The months following the attack proved that Sarah's performance had not been an isolated incident. She continued to demonstrate exceptional competence in all her medical duties, but now she did so with the full confidence and support of her unit. Other soldiers frequently sought her advice on health-related issues and trusted her judgment completely. Her medical skills continued to develop as well. Dr. Hayes, the senior physician who had evaluated Sarah's performance during the attack, arranged for additional training opportunities that would enhance Sarah's capabilities. This advanced training, combined with her proven performance under fire, positioned her for rapid promotion and increased responsibilities. The impact of Sarah's story extended beyond forward operating base Phoenix. When wounded soldiers were evacuated to larger medical facilities, they carried accounts of the extraordinary medic who had saved lives during the attack. These stories circulated among medical personnel throughout the theatre of operations, enhancing Sarah's reputation within the broader military medical community. Lieutenant Colonel Thompson ensured that Sarah's story became part of the official record of the base's operations. His detailed after-action reports included extensive documentation of her performance, creating a permanent record of what had occurred. These reports would serve as valuable case studies for military medical training and would help establish best practices for combat medicine. The Bronze Star Medal recommendation was approved at higher command levels, making Sarah one of the youngest soldiers to receive this decoration for medical heroism. The award ceremony, conducted several months later, was attended by senior officers who had read Thompson's reports and wanted to meet the medic who had performed so extraordinarily under fire. But perhaps the most meaningful recognition came from her patients. The soldiers whose lives Sarah had saved during the attack maintained contact with her throughout their recoveries. They wrote letters expressing their gratitude and sent updates about their progress. For Sarah, knowing that her efforts had made a real difference in these men's lives was more rewarding than any formal decoration. Years later, when Lieutenant Colonel Thompson was asked about the most memorable moments of his command, he would always mention Sarah's performance during the attack on Forward Operating Base Phoenix. He would describe her as one of the finest soldiers he had ever served with, and would use her story as an example of how preparation, competence, and courage could overcome any initial disadvantage. The young woman who had been called Tent Girl had become a legend within her unit and an inspiration for future military medics. Her story proved that heroes don't always come in the package people expect, and that the quiet person in the corner might be exactly the person you need when everything goes wrong. Sarah Martinez had found her place in the military and had proven that she belonged among the finest soldiers her country had to offer. The tent on the perimeter was no longer a symbol of isolation. It had become the command post of one of the most respected medics in the entire theatre of operations. The girl who had surprised everyone had become the soldier that everyone wanted on their team when the stakes were highest. Her story would continue to inspire soldiers for years to come, proving that courage, competence, and dedication could triumph over any challenge.